Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 3 of the Cross-Pollination podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Olivia R. Lucas. Dr. Lucas is assistant professor of music theory at Louisiana State University, and she got her Ph.D. in 2016 at Harvard University. In this conversation, we discuss her thesis, as well as some of the papers she has written or on which she's currently working. I first came across her work on the internet on the Music Theory Online website, where I read her 2018 paper entitled So Complete in Beautiful Deformity, Unexpected Beginnings and Rotated Riffs in Meshuggah's obZen, because I was looking for some more information about Meshuggah's songwriting techniques or about the way we can break down what happens in their music rhythmically. And I read the entire article, which was extremely interesting and intriguing. But I must say that after a first read, I understood it on a surface level, but I did not really understand what the research was about, maybe on a wider and deeper level. And that I started to understand when I started delving into her thesis, which is entitled Loudness, Rhythm and Environment, Analytical Issues in Extreme Metal Music. Now, I really recommend you read that thesis for yourself because it's extremely interesting. She starts out by describing a panorama of the contemporary extreme metal scenes, and then she goes on to analyze different aspects of 4 different bands, and each analysis was also separately released as a paper. So the thesis is divided into 3 parts. And the first one is called Maximum Volume Yields Maximum Results. It's an auto-ethnography of a concert of the band Sunn. The second part I already mentioned is a paper about the rhythmical aspects of the music of Meshuggah. And the third one is a comparison of 2 different modes of ecocriticism through the black metal band Botanist on the one hand, and the 2012 album Kentucky by band Panopticon on the other. Her approach to analyzing the different facets of these bands is very interesting because not only does she rely on traditional methods of music theory analysis and on traditional tools, but she is also really pluridisciplinary in her approach, and she uses methods from other fields such as cultural analysis, anthropology, ethnomusicology, ecomusicology, spectral analysis, psychophysics, and so on and so forth. And this interest in so many disciplines and on triangulating the nature of musical experiences through the prisms of different disciplines makes her, of course, the perfect interlocutor for the podcast. The reason why she relies on all these different angles is because her approach consists in starting with the embodied feeling of being at a metal concert, describing it in different ways, and only then starting to analyze it using different tools. I must say that her way of analyzing this music has really introduced me to new perspectives in how to apprehend it and to appreciate it. A good example of that would be the song from Meshuggah's album obZen entitled Pineal Gland Optics, that I really recommend you check out because we are going to talk about it actually in much more detail during the talk. But yeah, my understanding and perception of the song is very different now. So I encourage you once again, before we jump in the deep end, to give it a listen. And we also cover many, many more subjects, including her analysis of the bands Botanist and Panopticon, her current research on Meshuggah's live lights, the evolution of extreme metal at the age of the internet and of the place of women, the extremely loud music of Sunn, and so on and so forth. If you are interested in one subject in particular, or if you want to see the summary of this episode, you can find timestamps in the YouTube description, as well as footnotes. By the way, this is a transatlantic conversation recorded over Skype, so I hope you can forgive me for the vicissitudes of my internet connection, and that won't keep you from enjoying this talk as much as I did. And now I bring you Dr. Olivia R. Lucas. Hello, Dr. Lucas.
Hi.
Thank you for agreeing to this interview. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I'd like to start out by asking you about your background and what brought you to studying extreme metal in a scholarly context.
Well, I got into metal when I was a teenager, like many people do, but I certainly didn't think that I would end up researching it for my career. I was a music and German studies double major at university. And when I was graduating, I was encouraged to apply for some PhD programs. So I did that, but I applied to study the music of Arnold Schoenberg, this early 20th century German modernist composer. Yeah. And so I went to do my PhD at Harvard, thinking that I would continue studying this like early 20th century classical music. But then I was in an ethnography seminar with Kay Kaufman-Chalamet, a professor at Harvard. And for that course, everyone in the class had to do a small ethnography of something in the Boston area. And so I did my project on the metal scene in Worcester, Massachusetts. And after she read my project, the professor was like, it seems like, maybe this is what you're really interested in. Have you considered this as a thesis topic? And I was like, is that allowed? Because I didn't think that would be possible, but it turns out it was. And so then I did that for my thesis. So I was just very lucky to be in a supportive environment, I think.
Okay. At the time, did you want to study any specific band, or were you already interested in the bigger picture?
I was definitely interested in the bigger picture, although I knew that I wanted the music of Meshuggah to be like a big element of it. But I was also interested in the bigger picture, especially with like what's been happening in metal in like the last 20 years or so. As it becomes...
You mean in terms of the social evolutions of metal? Because you talk about this actually at the end of your thesis, and the evolution of that was especially noticeable, according to you, when you went to the same festival twice, 7 years apart, I think, and you just noticed the enormous difference.
Yeah, exactly. The social evolution and also the increasing institutionalization of it, with the fact that like you can take university courses in metal in some places, not everywhere, but in some places. And like I'm offering one next semester here at LSU where I'm currently working. And that, what was like, so in the case of the Tuska Festival, which is what I was writing about, what was a sort of small local festival or sort of national festival in Finland became this massive international sort of almost, English language festival that people came from all over Europe to. Yeah,
to attend. I mean, it's funny because it seems to be a global phenomenon, and myself going to metal festivals in France, I can really notice the difference and the way it evolves. Talking about that, I wanted to know, because at some point towards the end of the paper, you mention Phillipov's research about, Bakhtin's through Phillipov, and she mentions the carnavalesque quality of metal and the fact that it's not like other maybe more straightforward music genres where what is said is really the point, but it's more of a reversal of meaning. And I wondered if you could react on that.
A couple of things. I think one of the interesting things about the institutionalization factor is that this necessarily reduces some of the carnivalesque aspects of metal culture, right? And I sort of have, looked at that with the Tuska Festival. The first time I went to it in 2006, everyone could bring in their own drinks, and it wasn't really very organized, and so there was this sort of like beautiful chaos with like different people meeting, and everyone was really dirty, but it was like, it was really fun in a sort of chaotic way, and in a very, very metal way, very sort of like rebellious spirit. And then some years later, right, it's much more organized, right? There's like a clear security process at the gates. Everything is much cleaner and everything is on time. And it's very clear where to go to get clean water or to like wash your hands. And there's like the toilet situation is better. But it's more sterile in a way.
Yeah, it's
and
a give and take situation.
Yeah, and there's pluses and minuses to that, right? Because like a cleaner, better organized festival is going to be more accessible to, say, people with disabilities who also like metal, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the same time, some of that like original grassroots spirit is lost in a certain way. But the other thing that Phillipov is really thinking about is her project is largely focused on why metal music has been perceived as politically ineffective, in contrast to music like punk and hip hop, right? So if you look at like the world of sort of rebellious popular musics, I would say some of the top three that sort of come up are going to be metal, punk, and hip hop. And punk and hip hop have these clear political valences with very clear goals, whereas metal has often been perceived as like just rebellious for rebellion's sake and with no clear message, and therefore worse, effectively, in the views in the eyes of critics.
Okay.
And so she's sort of critiquing that by looking at how metal does construct political meaning.
Okay, that's paradoxical because you would expect, like, for example, maybe punk music back in at the end of the 70s or maybe hip hop must have been much more powerful ways of challenging the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Right, because they do it in such like straightforward ways.
Yeah.
Whereas in metal, it's often you can't really understand the lyrics. So it's like if you can't understand the lyrics, where else can the message come from? Like, can a message come from the overall sound and performance? Sort of what she's looking at. And then also, what do you do with metal lyrics that are just extremely gruesome or violent? Like, what is the meaning in those?
Yeah, and there is also this, sometimes you don't quite know. And for example, you mentioned black metal, and that's really a test case for this because you don't quite know how much of it is serious and how much of it is just for shock value. And the line sometimes seems to be purposely kept blurry.
Yeah, for sure. And then, you're back to the carnivalesque again, just sort of like this celebration of turning things upside down and of excess and shock.
Yeah. I want to ask you also about the internet because I was born in 95, so I did not really experience the metal scene as without mass internet. But that seems to have been a major factor, and it changed a lot. I've talked to older metalheads, and a lot of them were struggling for to find informations, and there were fanzines going around and being sold, and people collecting information about bands. And now it's all a click away on the internet. Not all, but a lot of it. And I wonder if you think that has to do with the institutionalization of metal that you were mentioning, and what kind of effect it can have. I mean, it has right now, and it probably can have in the future. Because effectively what was obscure with black metal now is maybe more famous than ever, paradoxically enough.
Yeah, I mean, so I just barely remember the sort of pre-internet age, and I wasn't really an active member of any music scenes prior to the internet. I think what I've noticed is that, so like my students who are, now 18, 19, 20, are a lot more musically omnivorous than because of, if they have like a Spotify subscription, for example, right, they can very easily try something new with like no extra cost or really any effort, because Spotify is always trying to like, feed you new stuff, right? So it becomes and even, and there's all sorts of platforms, right? And so everyone can try something new. So there's not as much of a like centralized mainstream with popular music. And then when it comes to metal, it's much less localized, right? It's not Bay Area thrash or Florida death metal, right? The whole like 80s and 90s situation where everything was like really localized to these specific scenes has sort of disappeared, except I find that there's like a sort of resurgence in reintroducing the local into metal, but specifically as a tactic to distinguish yourself musically.
What do you mean?
So, like, for example, do you know this New Zealand band, Alien Weaponry?
Yes, I've seen them actually a couple of months ago.
Yeah, me too. And I saw them a few times in New Zealand before they were even like internationally famous. But yeah, so that's an example of like, so that first album they did is really, it's like thrash metal, right?
Yeah.
But what they've added to it is stuff that is specifically Maori, which is also specifically New Zealand, right? So it's very much tied to a specific place and community, even though they are an internationally known band on a major record label that tours around the world.
Yeah, fair enough. And that seems now I see more what you mean, and that seems to be something that's on the rise. I'm thinking of bands like, I mean, it happened a lot with black metal bands where everybody would bring something of their maybe culture to the table. Like, for example, Jodk are doing, I think, Ukrainian traditional chants before Ukraine changed through, I mean, with the USSR period and everything. So yeah, I can definitely see that. And also about what you mentioned about eclecticism, I feel like it's becoming less and less transgressive. In the 90s and in the 2000s, it was really something. I don't know. There was a lot of talk about this, mixing rap and metal and nu metal and different. Also, the whole rise of the symphonic metal and all of that. I wonder if you have any idea of what might come next, because in my case, it's completely, I have no idea what the next frontier might be.
So I have a couple thoughts. Obviously, I don't know the future, so this is just speculation. Yeah. So one of the things that I've thought is that, things could sort of go one of two ways. One would be sort of increasing, just like continued increasing institutionalization until metal as a musical style becomes something akin to jazz, which is like widely taught in music schools. And so I can sort of imagine a future in which like elements of that performance style are like completely institutionalized in that sense. I also think that, with the internet and the increasingly widespread availability of affordable home recording and production technology, that metal will continue to sort of like fracture and splinter into all sorts of little subgenres and niche interests that still draw on a sort of metal musical language. And I also think we'll see a lot more in terms of genre hybridity. I think sort of one of the benefits of increased institutionalization is increased acceptance, and also like increased acceptance of like cannibalization of metal, right? So there are a lot more rappers, for example, that are working with elements of metal sound and not in a new metal type way, and vice versa. So
doing trap metal fusions, and I've seen that also arise more and more. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so your thesis is named Loudness, Rhythm, and Environment, Analytical Issues in Extreme Metal Music. And you just mentioned that you spent your undergrad and maybe graduate years studying Schoenberg and more 20th century music. And what you mentioned at the beginning of your thesis is that you've quickly come across the limitations of classical ways of analyzing music. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. The analytical issues and how do you parse this kind of music that is very different from maybe other forms of music that have been more classically studied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so classical music theory, or music theory as it's widely taught in North America, and I think in Europe as well, is largely based around European classical music from, let's say, 1700 to 1950 or so. And what it's really set up to do is analyze harmonic and pitch relationships in music. And so it has a lot of methods for understanding various elements of pitch and how those pitches relate to each other, whether it's through melody or harmony. And some of that comes even just from the way Western notation is written, right? It very much prioritizes plotting fundamental pitches and rhythms as long as they fall within a certain kind of grid that we're used to looking at. And so when you have a music like extreme metal, so take a band like Sunn, if you were to try to write that in Western pitch notation, you're going to lose everything, right?
Yeah, there is nothing left, literally. Right?
Yeah, like you'll have a fundamental pitch that goes on and on for pages, right? And none of what the audience is actually hearing is going to be there. And so so there's a few limitations that come up when you start analyzing something like metal. So one is that in a sort of academic music theory context, one is sort of expected to work from notation to a certain extent. And so with classical music, the composer's notated it for you, so you have the score to work from. Metal and other forms of popular music are not notated by the songwriters for the most part, and so you transcribe it yourself. But no act of transcription is neutral, right? Whenever you decide to write it down, you're deciding what elements of the music are going to make it onto the paper. And with something like Meshuggah, when I transcribe that, I know that what I'm looking for is primarily a rhythmic transcription so that I can show other people the sorts of rhythmic relationships I'm hearing. And I do plot the pitches on there, but I tend to leave out all the delicious bends and slides and ornaments that they have. And there's a couple other choices I make for convenience. With something like Sunn, I'm not even going to bother to try to put it in notation because it's just going to look silly, I think.
It makes no sense. You mentioned also the Derek Johnson, I think, transcription that incorporates all of these elements, but it's true that it's I was mentioning in our conversation before that it's a bit like, it seems to be like dancing to architecture in the way that we are representing or transcribing music way that this is absolutely not the way the musician thought, the way they were thinking about it when they wrote it. A striking example of that, you also mentioned the thesis from Smialek that I'm reading at the moment, and he shows in a part that actually, I think it's in death is death in catch 33, and so you have a multitude of pitches that seem to be completely random, but when you look at a guitar neck, you can see the pattern that the guitar players were following, which is a completely geometrical pattern.
Right, yeah, and that's the other thing is like a lot of music theory is very oriented around the keyboard, right, and keyboard instruments. And all students have to like learn certain fundamental keyboard skills. But something that's guitar-based is going to have a different geometry, right? Things that are very natural to play on the guitar physically are going to look really weird notated because they would be very awkward to play at a keyboard. So there's that element as well, for sure.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of metal music, I mean, there is a widespread rejection of music theory conceived in this, in a narrow sense, what we're talking about right now. And reading your thesis, it feels to me that you're trying to extend the definition of music theory to something wider that encompasses embodied experiences and also the social aspect of metal and stuff like that. And I wanted to ask you about the research that you've been doing about multimodality and the psychophysics of sound, the way sound feels, and also maybe the lights and the way it shapes the experience of somebody who is experiencing this type of music in a live context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the reasons I've been trying to sort of expand music theory this way is that, like most music theorists, I got into this because I really like music and I like listening to it. And it seems like that whole experience should be available for analysis and discussion, not just a sort of abstract version of it.
Yes.
Especially with something like metal, where the concert experience and the sort of live experience of being in the room with it is so fundamental to what metal is. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I noticed as I was continuing my research with Meshuggah is that over the last few years, their light shows have sort of gotten really intense. And in the sense that the lights are exactly following the music rhythmically, and then also interpreting the gestures and contours of the music as well, with different parts highlighted through the lighting. And then, when a section repeats, the same lighting will come back or similar lighting will come back to show you that repetition is happening. And I think it's particularly interesting in the context of Meshuggah, because they're on the one hand known as this band with really complicated rhythms, but then they have a sort of broad audience that goes way beyond people who are musically educated and specifically listening for those rhythms, right? They have this sort of this like rock band mentality. And so on the one hand, the lighting provides this really sophisticated interpretation of everything that's going on in the music, but it also provides like a visual guide to everything that's happening that's completely accessible in a way that notation and traditional music theory is not. Yeah, it creates a sort of what I call a vernacular music theory that isn't based on notation, but is based on a lot of the things that music theory is based on, which is close listening and expert knowledge of what's going on in the music.
Yeah. How do you go about studying these light shows? What is your strategy for? Well,
I got in touch with Meshuggah's lighting designer, this guy named Edvard Hansson. Yeah. And he very kindly gave me a lengthy interview in which he told me about his process, both the creative side and the technical side. And he also gave me a bunch of videos, because he videos all the shows, that he can watch his own work and keep working on it and keep improving it. And so then I'll do my transcription of the music and then sort of align it with the video of the lights. And so what I ended up doing is I sort of ended up separating how the lighting is done into two different categories. And so I looked at those two categories as on on the one hand, elements of the lighting that are doing something small and local, right? So within a single riff pattern,
Yes.
it might show the difference between a single string section and a power chord section, right? Meshuggah has a lot of riffs that sort of combine those two elements. And so the lighting will like play up that contrast. And then the other category would be ways that the lighting shows larger structural elements across a whole song.
Okay.
And so then, I just find interesting passages in the lights and in the music and see what he's doing there. And one of the things that I find really interesting is the extent to which the lighting designer is then given power to sort of interpret the music and almost tell the audience exactly what to listen to and how to listen to it, because the sort of the cognitive research behind all this, which is something that I'm not personally an expert in, but I know some people who do this work, shows that the visual cues will change what you hear.
Oh yeah, the McGurk effect, right?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I just know this. It's an interesting experiment where you have a person on video saying either v or f, I think, like that, and depending on the way they mouth move, it changes the way you perceive the sound. So you're actually getting your cue from the way the person's mouth moves, and not what the phoneme they're actually saying.
Right, and the deaf percussionist Evelyn Glennie?
No.
So it's fascinating. She was born deaf, profoundly deaf since birth, but she speaks with a strong Scottish accent because she's Scottish, right? And she.
Oh yeah, you mentioned her in your thesis. Yeah.
Yes,
I know
she's
who
really
you're talking
amazing.
about.
And she has this cool TED talk, and where she talks about her work as a percussionist, and also you get to hear her fantastic Scottish accent. But yeah, and also like a brighter light will make a sound louder for you. So by the way Hansen is doing the things he's doing, he's actually changing the way the audience hears the music to some extent.
Yeah. Would it fair to say that he is kind of nerdifying the headbangers in the first row? Just talking about your auto-ethnography that you mentioned at the beginning, where there is you kind of divide the crowd into nerds on the balcony that are counting out every rhythm, and just people that are just crowd killing in the pit.
I think
so. In a sense,
I think he's really like bringing the two closer together.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, he's done the nerdy work of figuring out every beat of the music and then putting it into the lights. But he also creates this really accessible interpretation that's there for everyone. So it's like both a performance and an analysis at the same time.
Yeah, it seems to, just from an outsider perspective, it seems to take more and more space in their music. Just watching the music video of Clockworks that was made by a fractal artist, and actually you can see the light flashing following the rhythm of whatever, because the video is divided through different instrumentalists, and you can see the video flashing following the rhythm of what they are playing. And it also seems to me like gen bands in general, myself included actually, are incorporating this light show thing more and more, and I tend to see it in more and more in music shows.
Yeah, I don't know if that's because it's easier now to have fancier lights, or in Meshuggah's case, they can afford to hire someone to like go on tour with them full time and do all this, but
it's also maybe related to, I feel like a lot of Meshuggah is a lot of what they do is related to the evolution of technology. And for example, that really started, I might be wrong there, I don't really know, but it seems to me that might have started when they started playing to click tracks, because it's much before, I don't know if it was the same light engineer, but I know he was playing everything by hand, which was absolutely crazy to see. but he doesn't have as many possibilities doing that probably as he has using advanced software to program the lights.
Yeah, so that lighting designer's been with them since 2011, and when he started, he was doing it by hand, and that's why there's like all those videos of him on YouTube playing everything by hand, and it's like in time with the music and stuff. But the reason he automated it is because he didn't want people taking videos of him. He wanted the audience like focused on the band.
Yeah.
So he's like, oh, I don't want to distract them, so I have to find a way to automate this, and so he did. And yeah, and then starting with the Violent Sleep of Reason tour, I think is where things like really took off and got like, you know, really super precise. And
yeah, for sure. I mean, I've seen a show of them myself at a festival, and it's true that the experience really changed. Every time I see them, the experience changes. But what I was referring to earlier, and I'd like to have your thoughts on this, is the use of technology in Meshuggah, because they seem to me to have pioneered a lot of things that come later in the mainstream. So right now we're talking about the lights, but also in terms of music, the fact that they used programmed drums in 2005 on Catch 33, and the fact that they pioneered this. I mean, they were probably not the first, but the drum kit from hell, the like MIDI instrument that they used to do the drums, has been used by countless bands before, and the songwriting techniques they've pioneered with that album and the album before are used by tons of bands now, like gen bands, and that enables a new possibilities in writing super complex music. And so, yeah, I wonder what you think about that and the way technology shapes music creation.
yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that on the most recent album, they moved away from this, right? Because they recorded the whole thing live in studio.
Yeah.
Whereas like all these previous albums, they've done the program thing, right? And so one of the things that allowed them is sort of kind of pie in the sky composition, right? And if you watch some of the like, there's an interview with Thomas Hake from like around when the Kolos album came out, and he's like talking about their process, about so and so comes up with a part for the song, and so whoever starts writing the song, right, then writes all the parts for the other players, right? And then the other players have to come and be like, you know, this actually isn't possible on my instrument. What can we change it to? And so the programming and recording it that way sort of lets them record things that are actually sort of beyond human capability to realistically play. And so prior to, you know, to Violent Sleep of Reason, their albums are sort of dotted here and there with songs that have never been performed live.
Oh yeah,
because
like the Devil's Name is Surveillance.
Yeah, and Pineal Gland Optics, right, which is the one, which is, I mean, it's a totally fascinating composition and piece of music. And, you know, and there are bedroom sort of YouTube musicians that have performed that guitar part, but, you know, but that's a very different sort of ideal condition than putting a piece like that up on stage.
Do you think that in the case of Pineal Gland Optics, it's because of the song's complexity, or do you think that it's more because maybe it's considered a B-side and they don't play it that much? I'm not sure. Because in the case of The Devil's Name is Surveillance, this is torture on the drum kit. Like, it's just like blast beats. Just like he doesn't stop, you know, for the whole song. So, yeah. What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't really know. It could be that they just don't think it has legs, like it's the wrong tempo or whatever for a live show. But I mean, I do think that the guitar part for that is pretty nuts because of the isorhythm, because you have a pitch pattern of one length and a rhythm pattern of a different length that are only going to align every 56 attacks or whatever. And so to actually faithfully reproduce that is going to be challenging.
Yeah, could you please describe for a second this intro riff? Because, I mean, it's really fascinating. When I was listening to it, I really listened to it differently now, because I did not really get what was happening before reading your description of it in your paper.
Okay. I'm just going to pull it up real quick so I'm looking at it.
Yeah, no problem.
Just so I don't make any small errors or anything.
Yeah. I mean, I had no idea it was that complicated until you went through I think it's 4 different layers that are superimposed and moving, just combining in different combinations, which is pretty advanced. And
okay, so here we go. If we start with sort of like the pitch layer, right, in the opening riff, there's an 8 attack pitch pattern. So there's 8 different pitches played before the pattern repeats, right? And so then the simple, on its own, it's a simple pattern that repeats. But it's never going to be heard as like a nice melody because it's based on these sort of minor ninth leaps, these like big jagged leaps, right? So it's not very melodic, but it is a repeating pattern and it's 8 attacks long. However, that is layered over a repeating rhythmic pattern that has 14 attacks. That pattern is largely based on sort of 8th, 16ths, and there's a single dotted 8th near the end of the pattern. And so if you put those 2 elements together, you have this 8 attack pitch pattern cycling over a 14 attack rhythmic pattern. And so the lowest common denominator for those is going to be the 57th attack is when they will start at the same time again. Otherwise, they're out of alignment. So that if you're laying that over 4/4, that's going to be on the downbeat of measure 7. And so then when
you have 6/4 and then 4/4 that are superimposed, but the pitch pattern is a group of 14 different pitches, so it keeps on moving. It's not the same.
Yeah. So each time, so that you're not getting strong links orally between certain pitches and certain rhythms because it keeps different pitches get associated with different rhythms. And then when you put that in the whole context of the opening of the song with like the drums and the lead guitar, so the rhythmic pattern is 6 beats long, so a measure and a half and 4/4. But at the same time, you've got the lead guitar doing this sort of slow oscillation on a semitone that sort of, it kind of gives you a feeling of every other downbeat, but it's like it takes a little too long at the same time to be really reliable. And the drums are sort of going along with the guitar part. And then, I mean, what I found, do you want me to go ahead and talk about the sort of thesis of this article? So what I'm doing with this, in analyzing this riff in this article, is talking about how the rhythmic pattern of that riff causes the listener to hear where the beginning is differently, right? So normally you would assume that whatever you hear first is the beginning, but because of these various factors, right, the isorhythm and the minor ninth leaps and all these other factors, the thing that comes through most clearly in the riff is the longest duration, which is this dotted 8th note, and that's what, for me, ends up sounding like the beginning of the riff, even though it's actually towards the end of the pattern as you first hear it. But because it has the strongest accent, it sort of reorients your listening, which then sort of changes how the actual like ending of the song segment sounds. Yeah,
it's really a fascinating thing because, and I wonder actually how you went about this, and was it just you listening to the music and realizing that your perception of beginningness was changing listening to that riff, or for example to the second riff of Provost that you talk about later? How did that come about? How did you realize that was happening?
I'm trying to remember. I don't know if I remember exactly how I first sort of stumbled on this. I know that back in graduate school, I was really interested in working from intuitive ways of hearing, and in many ways, I don't have the world's like best ear. Like there are people who can hear music and just sort of like instantly write it down, even if it's very complicated. Whereas for me, transcribing something like Meshuggah is still a fair amount of work. And so I was looking for ways to sort of trust my instinct. Because one of the things that really interests me about music theory and teaching music theory is that, by the time someone gets to university, they've listened to a lot of music, right? And so they actually know a lot about music. They just don't know how to talk about it or put it into words, right?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in finding ways to like put into words what you already know in your body just from listening to a lot of music. And then I sort of combined that with this idea of trying to find alternative ways of visualizing the music. So like doing the spectrogram analysis, for example.
Right.
And so then I think I noticed in the spectrogram that like very different visual groupings occur in that context than in a notation context. And because those rhythms come through in the spectrogram, it's sort of like it backs up the way that you're hearing it instinctively without sort of the distraction of the notation.
Yeah, because with 4/4 you have kind of this artificial bar line that usually makes sense, but in that specific case doesn't really make sense.
Right? Yeah, or it makes sense. I mean, the 4/4 makes sense in terms of the architecture of the whole piece. And for like understanding how the whole thing is put together, but it can be sort of destabilized on the surface by depending on how they've put the riff together.
So you have this sort of what I would call a first principles approach to music theory when you are actually listening and asking yourself what you hear and then elaborating an approach based on that, on what you hear. And I wanted to ask you about the first part of the thesis and the paper about Sunn, because as you mentioned before, many maybe music theorists would have gone to such a concert and be like, yeah, there is absolutely nothing to say there. It's like one note happening and lasting for 5 minutes. And actually, I would like to know how you went about analyzing their music and the effect it produces on the body.
So really, I mean, to be perfectly honest, what happened is I didn't really know what to do other than, I mean, I knew that I had loved the concert and that it had been a sort of amazing, intense experience. And I think what happened was that my thesis advisor was like, have you read any of David Foster Wallace's essays? And I was like, no, I have not. And he was like, why don't you read the essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, which is David Foster Wallace's essay on going on a cruise.
Okay.
And it's right. So like going on a cruise is supposedly this fun thing, but because he's David Foster Wallace, he hates it. And it's quite funny, right? It's one of his sort of, it's got his humor and his seriousness in it. But the thing that he wanted me to see in it was like the way it balances sort of thick description of stuff that's happening with also then like sort of backing up and looking at it critically. So weirdly, that was sort of the inspiration for what I did. So and you can see that in my approach. There's sort of this thick description of what's happening to me and what I'm experiencing in the concert, and then a sort of backing away and taking a more critical stance and like pulling in other things that might be related to give it more context.
Yeah, I mean, you say, and I feel like reading I think it's the thesis that I read that was the easiest and most entertaining thesis I've ever read, because you change from a narrative perspective to an analytic perspective, and you have this humor in your thesis. Sometimes there are jokes. I mean, it's not really a joke, but for example, at the end of the Sunn paper, you say that the music dances you, and that you realize that your teeth were not completely stuck in your teeth sockets because of the sheer power of the volume and the way it was shaking your body.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel strongly that there's no reason that an academic writer needs to pretend to be like outside of whatever they're studying. That like there's this idea that like you can give a completely unbiased perspective. Well, you can't. Like I'm a person living in a body in a certain time and place. Like I'm going to have a perspective and a bias, and my experiences are going to influence how I write about things. So I sort of like, why not be honest about that and just sort of incorporate it into the analysis. And people can maybe learn something from that, but also maybe like bring their own experiences and say like, well, I experienced it this way, and then we can really have a conversation,
Yeah. You say at the beginning of the essay that you're interested in exploring the relationship between, on the one hand, extreme metal and on the other hand, scholarly practices. And we've been talking a lot about right now about how you adapted scholarly practices to extreme metal, but now I feel like we are starting to talk about the way they can like be developed based on these things. And I wonder in what way do you think music theory and music analysis could be developed based on this very different kind of music and this different reality?
That's a really good question. So I think on the one hand, one of the things it does is it reminds people that music is fundamentally an embodied experience, and it can be very fun to abstract music and to look for little hermetic details and relationships that are primarily abstract in nature. But at the end of the day, we like music because of the way it feels. And so incorporating that into discussions of music and music theory, it can sort of suggest that like the way it can help expand into areas where the way something is listened to is just as important as what is heard, right? So the fact that the concerts are extremely loud in the way, on the extreme end, something like a Sunn concert, but even a Meshuggah concert or any of the other concerts I talk about are extremely loud, and that's an important part of the experience, right? Is like driving all other thoughts and feelings out of the body, so that the music takes over, which is not a feature that's exclusive to metal, right? Any sort of most popular music concert experiences are extremely loud these days, sort of taking over mind and body in this way.
I mean, it seems to me that there is some kind of maybe a mystery there, which is related to consciousness, in the sense that music perception is an inherently personal experience, and it's really, really hard to share. Writing about music is not a simple task, and yet, as a composer and as someone who creates music, we have to kind of do this maybe epistemological leap and trust that the way we feel about our own music is the way that a listener is gonna feel about it. But it seems to me that some composers really think about the impact they want to produce on their listeners, and some of them don't, and just like drop something and expect it to. Don't really think about the way it's gonna influence the listener and the way it's gonna be perceived. Do you know what I mean? Or
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways of writing music, and I don't know that there's, I don't think there's like a right way or a wrong way. I think it depends on what you want to achieve, right? Whether, this sort of gets into like, is art an expression of self, or should it be a reflection of reality, and those kinds of questions. But I think you're really onto something with the struggle of like writing about music, or even just talking about it in words. And it's something that I think pretty much all music theorists grapple with on some level, because, it takes way longer to describe in words something that's happening in music, and it's also 100 times more boring than actually listening to it. So it's like, but at the same time, you feel like you have something to say about what's going on, and you want to communicate your enthusiasm about whatever it is that's happening, and also be able to have a conversation with other music theorists. You have to find some common ground somewhere, which usually means some combination of words and images, neither of which are actually music in and of themselves, which again is one of the things I love about these interpretive light shows, right? Because it is an analysis, but it's also co-temporal with the music in a way that words can never be.
Yeah, I feel like it's very important, which is maybe an unpopular opinion in the sense that a lot of the composers and the songwriters I know have this kind of anti-intellectual stance where, just feel it, man. And that's what you mentioned a little bit about Meshuggah when you say that they have, and I quote, rock is from the heart attitude. But I feel like, and of course you can never convey what is going on, how a song feels by just writing about it. But reading your paper, for example, the way I listen to the music is different now. You learn to listen to different things. And so I feel like it's really worth it in a sense, because if anything, it informs composers on the way, on tools they can use and the way they can shape the perception of their listeners. So yeah, how do you think your research like yours, but also the research of Peace-like, who wrote Recasting Metal, and the research of Smilek, for example, can influence composers and can lead them to maybe use the ideas that you outline in your paper?
Well, there's a lot of composers these days who are inspired by Meshuggah and other bands like them, sort of contemporary jazz composers and other composers that I've either met or heard of over time. And it's also I think there's an element of composition that is turning toward these kinds of groove-oriented music, groove-oriented musics. So, for example, there is an Indonesian composer who writes for gamelan, right, which is the traditional Indonesian orchestra. But he doesn't write traditional gamelan music, which is primarily an oral tradition, right, where there's no notation involved. But he brings in these elements of a certain kind of cipher notation, so that he can compose more complex things for the players that then are doing things not entirely unrelated to the kinds of things Meshuggah is doing in their music, with these sort of complex grooves that have an underlying organizational feature, but extremely complicated surface rhythms. And that's the kind of hybridity that I see happening around the world, sort of taking all the sort of amazing timbral and pitch features of the gamelan orchestra. And it's already, because it's essentially a percussion orchestra, it's already oriented toward a sort of timbral rhythmic type of music, and then harnessing that towards the kinds of complex grooves that are prevalent in popular music, and it creates this sort of amazing hybrid of all the different of all the world's different musical possibilities.
Yeah, I wonder if you're aware of the music of Tigran Hamasyan, because that brings him to mind immediately.
Yes, absolutely. I actually had a master's student back in New Zealand who wrote this whole crazy thesis about jazz and Between the Buried and Me and Meshuggah, and and then wrote his own and then he wrote a suite for big band and metal guitar that sort of like combined features of jazz and extreme metal. So yeah, I see that. I see this kind of hybridity happening all over the place with my students and with composers that I know and that I read about.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in reading that paper. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I can
Sure.
introduce you to.
That would be great.
But yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of us. There's like a whole little group of us now that are doing like music theory of extreme metal. Right, so there's me and Pieslack, who wrote the first paper, but who isn't really. He's working on like music in like extreme war zones and like extremism.
Right.
Totally interesting stuff. But it's just like he's just like not really working on Meshuggah anymore. And Guy Capuzzo also is working on Meshuggah, and Smielek did that thing. And then there's a guy who's doing a Ph.D. at Columbia University, who's doing a lot of work on the band Carbomb, if you're familiar with them. Sort of like the latest.
Oh, really?
Latest. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds really interesting because, what they've done with the last two albums is absolutely amazing. Yeah, and it's very inspired from Meshuggah, but then they bring this whole new, soundscaping and shaping that is very unique. Yeah, I'd be really interested in that too. Actually, talking about that, I live in Berlin, and so I'm just living with like electronic music producers. And you mentioned a paper by Mark Butler called I think Unlocking the Groove, which is similar to yours, a multifaceted approach to electronic dance music. And I would like to know, I also feel like people that write metal music and fusion music are more and more influenced by this producer's approach to writing guitar music. And I'd love to know what you think about that, and also how you used Mark Butler's paper in your own research.
So Mark Butler's book, and he came out with a second book while I was working. So the first one is Unlocking the Groove, and the second one is Turning the Beat Around. Yeah, okay. I think it was originally a thesis, but he turned it into a book, and then he has a second book called Turning the Beat Around. And that first book was really, really important for me because it was kind of the first book that was like just music theory of a popular music genre. And so while it was a different genre than what I was working on, it was a really important model for how that could be done, right? Because he doesn't just like write about the rhythms and stuff, right? He also does like ethnography and interviews with different producers and stuff. So he incorporates ethnography and like the perspectives of the musicians in it as well. And that was sort of like, there were elements of that I very much wanted to use as well. So combining ethnography with music theory to do work in a popular music genre. And so, just having that as a model was really important for my work.
So do you feel like I wonder if you can talk a little bit about doing auto-ethnographies and what that really means and what that amounts to, and how you feel that this can really shed a different light on the music that you're studying, and how interesting it can be for readers and listeners.
Yeah, so auto-ethnography is really just a subset of ethnography. And ethnography is, of course, a technique that comes from anthropology, which is really studying the cultural context, right? So ethnomusicology, right, is studying music in its cultural context. And so I did ethnography of like the Tuska festivals, right? I was there. I would talk to people and write about the whole context of it. And then an auto-ethnography is an ethnography of yourself and your own experience, right? So that's essentially what I've done in the Sunn paper, is like an auto-ethnography where it really is focusing on my own experience with music in a cultural context. And I've found that it can help me really understand myself better and how I listen to things, and also understand how I am contextualized, right? What is my role and my place in a particular situation, which then, leads you to the bigger picture anyways. So it doesn't have to be like, it's not like completely like navel gazing, like just my own thoughts and feelings, but understanding the bigger picture through my own experience, which is it requires a kind of real honesty with yourself and about your own experience. And it's really like, it's almost like a critical perspective on how you experience the world every day in your own life. Because really, at the end of the day, all I can really know is my own experience, and everything else that I do understand is being filtered through that experience.
So, do you contrast your own experience with maybe some testimonies that you collect, and then you are led to asking yourself the question of whether or not what you feel is a personal experience or a shared experience? And when it comes to the sociological prism that you've been adopting in the third part of your paper, I think it's really interesting because you are documenting the evolution of black metal, which used to be this very narrow thing, and that is now expanding in every direction and covering aspects of life that are really not expected to be covered by black metal.
Yeah, so I think like broadly over the course of the whole thesis, I sort of move outward from myself, right? The first chapter with the Sunn thing is very about like my own experience of this concert, and then sort of understanding that in a wider context. And then the Meshuggah chapter is sort of somewhere in between, right? It's like very much involved with these conversations in academic music theory, but at the end of the day, it's still about how I hear a thing.
Yes.
And then the last section on the environmentalist black metal is the most external in a way. It's kind of looking at how this sort of bizarre subgenre of metal interacts with the world and how that interaction is changing.
Yeah, so you talk about, two bands specifically. You talk about the band Botanist and about the band Panopticon and their album, I think 2012 album Kentucky, and how they relate to two different modes of ecocriticism, and in the sense that they are criticizing the evolution of the environment and the fact that we are in some ways destroying the planet. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these two bands and the very different approach they have.
Yeah, so it started from me noticing that there was this sort of environmentalist turn in part of black metal, right, where they got super interested in environmentalism. And so I chose these two examples because they offer such different approaches to environmental critique. So Panopticon's album Kentucky deals with the history and cost, both environmental and social, of coal mining in the Central Appalachian coal region, which is this region and sort of like the central eastern part of the United States in the Appalachian Mountains, which are very old mountains, which mean they contain coal. And coal has been mined out of those mountains for a long time. And the people in power have, basically since coal was first mined, abused the people who lived and worked there and worked in their mines, as well as the environment. And so what Panopticon is really, that's a one person project, is he's sort of created this concept album in which he links the abuse of the land and the environment with the abuse of the human population throughout the regions, basically from the time of colonial settlement forward, right? And sort of ends with this issue of mountaintop removal mining, which is a more modern kind of mining that involves like basically blasting off the entire top of the mountain rather than digging underground to extract the resources. And I've found it really interesting the way he draws on various black metal sounds and tropes, sort of bluegrass and local music tropes, as well as different sound artifacts from meetings and protests and strikes and documentaries to create this like really complete picture of a relatively small and local environmental issue, right? So it's like a small piece of the whole picture, but it's a very detailed picture of exactly how this environmental degradation happens and how it also hurts humans.
It's very historical in approach. I feel it seems to me to be pervasive through metal, and in that case it's pretty striking because you compare that album with a band called Appalachian Terror Unit, which is much more, I think it's a punk band, right?
Yeah.
And the way the very different approach that they adopt when it comes to criticizing mountain top removal mining and stuff like that. And it seems to me, I wonder what you think about that. It seems to me that black metal in general and metal maybe in general adopts when describing something this very historical third person narrative that maybe with punk and hardcore is much more embodied and like criticizing and very direct.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. I think there's a kind of personal authenticity and like authenticity of expression that's very important in punk music, right? Where like you need to hear how the person singing or screaming feels, and it needs to be what they're really feeling. Whereas metal has different aesthetic values, where things like instrumental competency, right, being able to play your instrument well, is a really strong value in metal. Like if you're doing an album about a thing, doing research and getting all the nerdy details right is a stronger value in metal than I would say than it is in something like Appalachian Terror Unit, which is just approaching the problem from a different angle, right? Because if you look at something like Botanist, right, that's like it's got all this like extreme research on like all the Latin taxonomical names for plants and the chemicals in them, but like, and then it's like presented in this way where you can't even understand what he's saying anyways, but presents this sort of like global apocalyptic view, this sort of like imagined fantasy of plants rising up and destroying humanity in this like apocalyptic vision. And I think, they're getting at two different ways of trying to bring about environmental change, right? Panopticon is making a more like social, historical, humanistically oriented plea for change, whereas Botanist is more saying, the apocalypse is coming and it's all going to be over and the environment does not care about you or how you feel.
Yeah, the approach of Botanist, actually you mentioned it in the paper, but it reminded me, just reading their lyrics, it reminded me a lot of Carcass, that is one of my favorite bands, and of the fact that every time I read a Carcass lyric, I would learn a new word for every phrase. But also that there is this approach where it's a lot of nominal phrases. It's not really phrases. It reminds me of maybe comparing it to painting. It would be Impressionism, because it's just like syntagmas and groups of words that are thrown in your face, and they don't really mean something very precise or specific, but they tend to create this landscape and this like overall feeling. It's like an extension of the music almost. I feel there is this poetic quality in which the musician doesn't want to break the spell maybe of the impression that the music gives the listener by being too clear and too direct in what they say.
Right, yeah, it's all about, I mean, black metal is all about creating an atmosphere, right? And the sorts of like ceremonial trappings of that are very important in black metal, whether, and from like the lyrics to like wearing a robe on stage to having like a artistic pseudonym, all these sorts of performative aspects are like really important in black metal in a way that's not true of other subgenres.
Yeah, there seems to be this really ritualistic suspension of disbelief aspect. And I'm wondering, I also wanted to ask you about something else. I remember the controversy a couple of years ago when Sunn came on the scene, because they were like hipster looking, I'm quoting there, black metal band, and they had like a pink cover art and whatever, but it was
Deaf
nothing
Heaven
compared.
And the Sun. You're talking about the Sunbather album. Okay, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I said Sunn. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
that's
confused.
okay. I was like, I don't know them. But yeah, okay,
No.
I'm with you.
Yeah, sorry. And what I was getting at is that, I mean, that was a big controversy, but it was nothing compared to Mirker when she stepped on the scene as the first one-woman black metal band. And you mentioned really quickly the place of women in metal and how it's evolving, and your thoughts about it at the end of your thesis. And I wanted to know what you think about that, how it's evolving, how they've been traditionally represented, and the fact that metal is mostly a male thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so there was that whole like hipster black metal scene with Deaf Heaven and Sunbather and Liturgy, right? Was the other band, and Hunter Hendricks wrote that thing, and people got all upset. And then Mirker showed up and was doing things that like, heaps of black metal bands had done before her, with like incorporating mythology and that kind of imagery. But because she had a past as like being in an indie band, like, she wasn't taken seriously by some people. I feel like it's like people are over it now. She's fine. She's on maternity leave right now, but I think she's going to, have a new album next year or something. But I think, so my experience of metal has always been gendered, right, as a woman who's interested in metal. And one of the things that has always really fascinated me is that if you look at academics who study metal, so music theory is sort of a weird outlier because music theory is very male dominated. But if you look at like all the academics who study metal, so including like people taking sociological perspectives, anthropology, media studies, all those kinds of academics, women seem to be much more strongly represented there than in the sort of metal fan base at large. And this is not something I've studied, so this is entirely anecdotal and personal experience. But I think, one of the things that happened for me is that because I was always in the minority, when I would meet male metal fans, there was often a lot of like, asking me what I liked about metal, or even just people in general, why did I like metal? People would ask me to like name what bands I would like. And if it was like a male metal fan, it had to like, meet check boxes on his list of like what a real metal fan would like. And so this process of constantly having to explain and justify myself sort of forced me to like become an expert on metal. And I think a lot of women have had that experience as well.
Well,
and
then it
it's
had
like,
a good consequence.
Right, yeah. So then it's like, well, I've already done all this work to find out all this stuff. I might as well and then it turned out that I could do that for a career. And so I think in that sense, like women who are involved in metal are a lot of times already being forced to sort of think critically about it because they're being asked about it. But at the same time, the genre itself remains predominantly male. And I think that is changing, but slowly. I've seen, I saw this amazing Australian band called Caerulean that had, and it was like a proggy, like technical metal band with a female guitarist, 7-string guitar, all that, right? She was so good.
Mhm.
And so like things like that are happening, right? You're starting to see like female
Yeah.
vocalists are one thing, right? That's a thing that women often get assigned to in bands.
Yeah.
But like seeing women become guitarists and drummers and
Yeah.
bassists, I think is really important too. One of the things that I find really fascinating about female metal vocalists, though, is that in the context of a completely screamed vocal, without visual cues, you cannot know the gender of the performer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Like the metal scream is a gender neutralizing vocal style.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which is something
it's
that
a
I
funny way
find,
of putting it, yeah.
yeah. Like you can't make any assumptions just from hearing it.
No.
I mean, people do make assumptions, but they're not reliable. So
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's a really interesting thing about that as a vocal style. I don't know. I think, and the other side of this, right, is the way in which metal exists in a kind of white racial frame as well. So it's not only is it considered a male music, but it's considered a white music.
I mean, growing up in France and just seeing the crowd that goes to metal concerts, I can testify to that because it's true that it's almost only white guys, like young guys, pretty young, but not necessarily. But it's mostly, white guys.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that it tends to sort of is like believing that has like this, on the one hand, it's kind of true, but on the other hand, it has this side effect of sort of erasing the amount of metal that's going on in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, and places like that are not white Western countries, right? But have these like huge, vibrant metal scenes.
Do you feel like there is a tendency to that they are less present because of that? Because I mean, I feel like bands like Christian or Crisix or stuff like that, or Culture, but maybe it doesn't fit the proportion of, or Sarcophago, maybe it doesn't fit the proportion of like the number of people from these countries are not maybe represented as much. Maybe that's what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do with like countries that are perceived as producing a lot of metal.
Yeah.
And I think there are other factors, right? Like if Indonesian metal is not in English, right? Most of it's not. It's going to be harder to get international fans. And then the other thing I see is sort of like an exoticization of non-white bands that do gain international recognition, and having them be seen as primarily like, oh, they're the Chinese metal band, or So I mean, it's a complex issue, and I think there's a lot of angles to approach it from, because on the one hand, the sort of like predominant white maleness of metal needs to be acknowledged, but it shouldn't be at the expense of like erasing the exceptions.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you would say that, because I feel like it's almost like if a band comes from Scandinavia or from Finland, it's almost like they have a badge of quality attached to them. And you mentioned also in the paper at first, when you talk about your experience at Tuska Festival, and you make fun a little bit of this idea, this Rousseauian idea that metal is better made in the north because it's dark and people are hardcore and it's cold and stuff like that.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is like it's not just people outside of the Nordic countries who think that. Like I interviewed producers in Finland who, I asked them like, why do you think Finland is so well known for metal, or like why so much metal has been produced here, and they would be like, oh, because of the cold, dark winters. So like, I mean, this is like a belief that people have, and I maybe it's true, I don't know, but it's not the only reason that metal gets produced, because like Indonesia and Brazil are plenty hot, so
yeah, that's right. And it's funny because, I mean, at least I see it anecdotally, just growing up in France. Now I'm in Germany, but growing up in France, you have this like cult of, Vikingness and Viking metal. And for example, metalheads would have like, just like normal, I mean, people with very cliche French names would have like their last name on Facebook being Bjornsson or Thorson, or, like kind of emulating this whole thing. And I don't know if it comes from black metal and all that stuff, but you even have, I mean, of course they're not called like this, but Viking metal bands from France, based on our heritage, maybe as a Celtic, I mean, the Celtic tribes and stuff about which we know practically nothing. So I think it's interesting in that case because the Vikingness has been somehow extended to other countries, it seems.
Yeah, actually, to come back to Alien Weaponry, the New Zealand Maori band. So about, I don't know, a year and a half ago or so, they had this bio up on Facebook that like played up the said, I don't remember exactly what it said, but it said something about like the guys in the bands like flailing Viking locks, and like they're sort of like talking about their long blonde hair kind of thing, like sort of connecting them to this Viking metal heritage, even though what they were doing is like Maori metal, like their Maori identity, but like trying to connect them into this European Viking metal heritage. And then the interesting thing is that after they became like really internationally famous and were getting booked to all these European festivals, specifically because of their Maori identity and the fact that they were doing songs in the Maori language and about Maori history. And like it, it became clear that that's what people liked. That part about their Viking appearance, like got cut from the bio. It's not there anymore.
But is it something that has, I mean, did they start? They probably did not start like this, right? And it's something that they might, I don't know, I'm just guessing there, but that they might have incorporated later in their music? Or did they start with it?
That's kind of hard to answer because, like, they say that they started the band when they were like 8 years old, right? It's like, it's like, so when did they start being the band they are now? But the first songs that they got known for, even in New Zealand, were the Maori ones. Okay. So that's what they started winning awards with and like getting grants for making music videos. So that's so like their identity as like the band, we know now was very much started out being centered on this this finding their Maori identity with metal music.
Yeah, I was just guessing because of the name. I'm like, probably they could have found a super cool name that referenced some Maori deity or
but
their
it's like,
mythology.
I think, whatever age they were they were children when they started the band, and they had just seen the film District 9, I guess, and it comes from that.
Oh, okay. So, well, they got lucky. They could have found a way worse name. The ideas that we had when we were that age, we had the worst ideas. So that's not too bad. It works out quite well. Yeah. So talking about women in metal, and we were like talking about them a bit earlier. It's funny what you said about the gender neutral scream, because that's actually how I got introduced to metal personally. I went to a music shop and I asked for CDs, and the guy gave me a Gojira CD, a French band. I mean, another French band, and he also gave me an Arch Enemy CD.
Oh yeah.
And he told me, oh, it's a woman screaming on the album and stuff. Like it was some crazy thing. And and then I listened to it, and I was not expecting that, but it became my favorite band. I think now it's Meshuggah, but yeah. And what I wanted to say is that it feels like women in metal have to navigate this very, I mean, of course, it's not my experience, so I don't talk out of my experience here, but have to navigate this very fine line between, I mean, they are kind of forced to be objectified in a way. And I feel like Mercury kind of breaks that circle, because I feel like the singers from Arch Enemy really, I don't know what you think about that, but I felt like when Angela left the band and when they decided to hire Alicia White-Clues, as a replacement. I felt like it was really like before they were doing melodic death metal, and then it became this like female fronted metal band. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's a tricky thing for female performers everywhere, because on the one hand, they may be expected to be like the attractive front person of the band, but on the other hand, if they don't follow the sort of metal codes of authenticity, which mainly center on sort of like excellent performance skills, then they will be seen as posers. And there's definitely like a history of like female fronted metal bands, sort of abusing that front person, right? So if you look at like Nightwish, right, this really famous Finnish symphonic metal band, they've got a whole system where the men own the band, and the singer is just someone they hire on contract, right? Even though
really?
she's the one,
I had
she's
no
like
idea.
she's the face of the band, right?
Because
they've made that female voice so central to their sound. But whoever they hire is just on like a temporary contract, and they can dispose of her whenever they want, because they own the band, and are getting most of the proceeds from it. And I'm sure, at the same time, I'm sure there are bands with like healthy collaborative relationships. And I think Nightwish probably started that way, but after they got rid of the first singer, they just entered this cycle of like, the singers were basically treated as disposable.
I wanted to ask if it was this way already with Tarja, but maybe this was that there was Annette Olsen, and then the new and then Floor Jensen.
Yeah, and they've
so
stuck
you
with
say
her
that
for a
they
while.
were like hired. Sorry?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if anyone will ever really know the full. I mean, obviously somebody knows the full details of what happened with Tarja, but I think it was like after they got rid of her, they made this decision to like only hire vocalists on contract, right? So both Annette and Floor are just contracted vocalists for the band, even though like performatively they play this huge role of being like the sort of the face and voice of the sound.
Yeah, they are probably the most conspicuous part of it when it comes to just unsuspecting listeners, people that just listen to that day. But I think maybe the bass player, I forgot his name, but and the piano players are the ones that are really in charge of the band. Yeah, it seems like the front person, the fact that it's a woman is also interesting. I didn't know that. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about what you mentioned, this like poser / elitist mentality, because it's something that I find as well in other genres, but nothing comes close to metal when it comes to this kind of screening each other and testing each other to see if you're worthy, kind of. What do you think this is caused by?
Insecurity, I guess. Probably. I don't know. I feel like I'm a bit out of touch with this in a way because I just don't participate in it anymore. I'm not on these kinds of like forums or anything where this kind of thing happens anymore. But yeah, I guess if a genre of music is that big of a part of your identity, then proving your expertise is going to be a weapon against self-doubt and self-loathing, right? Because if you don't know enough, you're not good enough, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like your area of competition.
Yeah,
but
do
you think it's the like people that tend to be insecure are attracted to metal music, or do you think there is something else, or do you have any thoughts about that cause, or is it just nebulous?
I think it's possible that there's a link between like the population that listens to metal and people that are likely to have kinds of insecurity that lead to that sort of that kind of aggressiveness. I mean, we were just talking about like how young white men are sort of the predominant audience for metal, and teenagers are a notoriously insecure bunch, right? Who are really trying hard to figure out who they are. And so they might latch onto something like metal. And metal has a certain sort of like nerd appeal to it that involves like really diving deep into things and doing a lot of research on stuff. And then, if you combine that with a sort of like internet style echo chamber, you can get some really toxic results and some really unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah. But I wonder if it's something that has been very amplified by the internet, or if it existed on the same scale before.
Yeah, I don't know if I have really an answer for that, because I wasn't really in the metal scene before the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it seems to me that there is this weird dichotomy that we were talking about between serious and fun, in the sense that you have this whole aspect of the identity of the cliche metalhead, which is partying and getting drunk and doing all kinds of stupid stuff and doing salacious jokes. And then you have the other part, which is the maybe nerdier side, either being a musician and like playing in your room 8 hours a day to perfect your guitar skills, or just knowing every little detail about a band and being very just wanting to keep it to yourself and to your friends that are in the know. And I don't feel like that exists so much with other genres, but maybe I should get acquainted with the sociological research about metal.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, that kind of nerdy exploration can also be an opportunity for community building. So I think that in and of itself is pretty neutral. It just sort of, there's a lot of other factors that are going to determine whether it's going to become a toxic territorial scuffle or an opportunity for people with shared interest to build community and actually feel better about themselves.
Just looking, taking a step back a little bit, I wanted to ask you if you have other kinds of music you are interested in studying that go beyond the limits of that genre we've been talking about for almost 2 hours now.
Well,
other pursuits.
I really like a lot of different kinds of music. I used to be kind of like one of those metalheads who thought that metal was the best and other music was less good. But then I grew up,
Yeah, me too.
And and I realized there's like so much good music in the world. So I've actually gotten a lot more into hip hop in the last few years, and I've always loved sort of like dark electronica and sort of like synth pop type stuff.
I saw that you were mentioning Suzanne's Lindford album, the 10 Love Songs, I think.
Yeah, Susanna Sundfør. Yeah, I liked her first couple of albums. I really like Churches and Purity Ring, right? Those like synth pop bands.
I heard of Churches. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're like the most famous of those. And to be honest, I still love a lot of classical music as well. Like I've written some stuff about Arvo Pärt, the Estonian minimalist composer.
Oh, Arvo Pärt. I thought he was Finnish. Okay. I didn't know.
He's Estonian, and he has some really beautiful music that I really love.
Awesome. So what do you think triggered this shift from? Do you play an instrument, or do you create your own music?
So I originally trained in classical voice, so I am a singer, and I play the piano like okay, and I have dabbled a bit in composition here and there, but I would say that primarily I just enjoy playing like covers of other songs in my free time. Yeah. I was in a band briefly, but
sorry.
I've moved around so much in the last few years.
Oh yeah, you were in New Zealand and now you are in Louisiana, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I was asking you this because in my case, and I was wondering if you had a similar experience, but in my case, I started to play bass guitar, which is what I do most of the time, because we needed a bass player, and then this instrument became kind of a pivot that made me discover the rest of the music, because before I was like, yeah, rock and roll and metal music. But then this, in general, like by and large, metal is not the best genre for bass guitar. It's not where it shines the most and where it's really most explored. But in other genres like funk and jazz and you name it, like hip hop, neo soul, it's much more central. It's much more of a centerpiece of the music. So that's what introduced me to all the rest and to the fact that metal was nice, but there was also other things. And I just wanted to know if you had a similar experience.
Actually, I feel like I'm sort of weird because I'm a person who's like really into metal, but who never learned to play any of the metal instruments, other than like voice and keyboard. But those aren't the ones that are like primarily identified with metal. I started like learning a little bit of guitar. Yeah, guitars and drums. And it's like I've started learning like a little bit of guitar recently, but I'm still, nowhere near being like a metal guitarist. So I think the thing that has primarily gotten me into different kinds of music is like different vocal styles, right? Because I was, when I got into metal, I was like taking voice lessons. And of course, the first band I latched onto was Nightwish, right? And they still had Tarja as a vocalist back then. And I loved the way she sang, and I loved that could be combined with this like heavy guitars and stuff. So I got into like all of those sort of symphonic metal bands first. And, initially I was like, oh, I don't like the stuff with the screaming. But then I found out that I did like it, and I got into more stuff that way. And then like my route to hip hop was really like, it was, to be honest, it was Nicki Minaj, right? And she does like all this like crazy stuff with like she has so many voices. Yeah. And that's what I loved about it. And then of course I've like my interests have broadened significantly from there. But she does really interesting performance, I think, is what initially tends to grab me.
Oh, yeah. And it's also super interesting the way she is, like the whole world that is created around her in her videos and the lyrics and the whole aesthetics of the performer. And in general, I feel like just by talking to producer friends that the production techniques that are used in those two things are the same in many ways. Like not many people know this, but it seems like, producers nowadays that do metal records, they use auto-tune. It's like Melodyne, so it's not literally auto-tune, but on guitars, because guitars are not a perfect instrument and they tend to be out of tune, especially in the higher part of the register and stuff like that. So it's always very interesting to see the intersection points.
Yeah, that you can Melodyne, you can make anything sound like anything else. So
yeah. People use it on drum toms and stuff. It's really a music production multi-tool. Does everything. I wanted to ask you if you have papers to recommend to people that have read your work and that would like to dig deeper or in different directions, and maybe papers in the style that you really are not necessarily on that specific niche, but papers that you really enjoyed reading and that you think the community would benefit from knowing about.
Ooh, golly. Let me think. Well, if you want specifically to read more about Meshuggah, like around the same time as my So Complete Beautiful Deformity article came out, there was an article by Guy Capuzzo called Rhythmic Deviance in the Music of Meshuggah. And that's sort of interesting because we take very different approaches to the same music. And, we're in touch and like we're very familiar with each other's work, but it is very interesting. He creates these like beautiful graphs, these sort of like circular graphs that show how all the different parts align. There's like just, they're completely gorgeous, but they're also very abstract. So we have these sort of like contrasting approaches that I think like if you look at both of us together, you get like a sort of interesting summation of ways of thinking about the music. If you want to go back to like some of my earliest influences, right? So one of the reasons that I went to graduate school where I did, and to study what I did was because of a book called Meter as Rhythm.
Oh yeah,
which is
I wrote it down actually because you talk about this. You say that meter is projective, right? And it's a citation from this guy. I forgot his name.
Yeah, Christopher Hasty. So the book is pretty old now, but it's been extremely influential on sort of, and his book is originally applied exclusively to classical music of various time periods. But this idea that rhythm and meter is a very lively thing, that is a process that happens both in performing and listening, right, is extremely influential for people who want to sort of re-enliven this idea of music as an embodied experience, right? Like meter is not, it's not a grid, a conceptual grid that you lay stuff onto. It's an active, embodied process.
Yeah, and that's why you express skepticism at the idea of, I think it was Martin Hegström who said that, it's 4/4, there is nothing to, all of Meshuggah is 4/4 or something like that. And you say, well, it depends.
At the same time, like, I don't want to be, too hard on the guys in Meshuggah. Like, they're not thinking about their music theoretically, right? They're thinking about it as performers and writers, and I think they've found a method that works for them. But yeah, there is. There's also this. This is a bit unrelated now, honestly.
No, it's fine.
But I just read a paper by Noriko Manabe, and let me get you the exact title. But it's about, so it's called "We Gonna Be Alright: The Ambiguities of Kendrick Lamar's Protest Anthem." So it's about "All Right" off of To Pimp a Butterfly. And it's just really incredible with the way that it combines sort of hardcore music analysis of like all the different ways to hear the accents and rhythms in that song, and in like both the sort of first recorded version by Fabulous, and then the hook as recorded by Pharrell and used in Lamar's track, with linguistic analysis of African American English and the inflection patterns in it. And then it ends with an analysis of how the hook from that song, so "We Gonna Be All Right," was then used in protest marches in the United States as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it's a real tour de force of sort of interdisciplinary thinking, and just bringing together all these different facets of this one song, and how and sort of really gets at like how a detail of music theory, like the rhythm of a phrase, can change meaning and also like matter to society and the world because of the way that phrase is being used.
Oh yeah, like drawing links between the form and the content of the art, the way it's expressed and what it's saying in its text. Yeah, it seems to me that you also do that, especially at the beginning of the paper. Is so perfect. Sorry. What is it?
So
perfect
beautiful.
and beautiful. So complete in beautiful deformity. Yeah, that's it. When you talk about the anacrusis, the human anacrusis before the start of then the temporal beginning and the actual beginning of different things. And I wanted to ask you if you have thoughts, maybe if you could draw a parallel there with the music of Meshuggah and the way it's performed, like the lyrics.
Can you say a little more about that? Oh, the lyrics.
Sorry, I meant the lyrics. I said music, but I meant lyrics.
So while their most recent album is I feel like it's a little bit more explicitly political, in general, I feel that their lyrics have stuck to these sort of broad existential themes of being trapped, or trying to find the real truth, the inner reality, or something that's hidden within the system. So being trapped in a system and trying to break free of it to find the real truth. So this sort of essential existential struggle. and in the lyrics that comes through in different analogies and images and things like that. And I find that this has interesting parallels with the way their music is structured, right? Because it's built inside this system of segments of 4/4 meter, right? So like 8 bars or 16 bars of 4/4. And within that system, it's like these different riffs are trying to break free, but they always get, with a few exceptions, they get sort of like crushed by this system and like re-imprisoned in it. And it's that like struggle between the riff and the outer frame that sort of like propels the music forward. And then at the end of the paper, right, I link this to, that's another paper I was going to mention is the Joe Strauss paper on music theory and disability, because it really like picks apart how the metaphors that we use to talk about music tend to be very embodied metaphors, and they tend to be about certain kinds of healthy, able bodies. And so for example, certain theories of musical form, as he talks about, are imagined as being containers that have different parts, and different parts of the music belong in like these different containers. And then the composer does something that ruptures one of these containers, right? But the interesting thing is that in music, these things that cause a breakdown of the imagined structure are often the really aesthetically interesting things. Whereas in real life, the things that cause the breakdowns of bodies are things that are stigmatized. So on the one hand, the metaphors are deeply embodied, but there's a disconnect in the way they're actually applied in music theory and to the way people actually live their lives.
Yeah.
That was much more than you asked for, but
yeah, no, that's perfect. Actually, it's true that you mentioned that. But that's exactly. That's kind of what I was referring to when I talked about form and content, because you say that the jarring aspect and the fact that the struggle of the riff to get out of the restraints of the meter or the perceived meter is what propels Meshuggah's music forward. And it's also the lyrics, because that reminds me of that line from Catch 33, which is the struggle to free myself from restraints becomes my very shackles. So I think it's pretty spot on. At least it felt right to me. I just didn't know about this paper but that makes total sense actually.
Yeah, it's it totally changed my way of thinking, or like sort of like opened up this whole new thing that I had never even thought about before, especially like as someone who's interested in sort of like reincorporating embodied experience into thinking about metal. It's important to remember that embodied experience varies very widely among humans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And to me it looks like I was just flabbergasted just coming from the outside, like being a musician and not having read any of that, at the amount and the quantity and the depth of the academic literature about such specific, what seemed to me as specific subjects. Like there are so many things out there. It is pretty, it gives me vertigo almost.
Yeah, it is pretty overwhelming. Some of it is just the reality of being an academic, because we're all forced to publish so much,
Yeah. But, also the whole part where you were referencing to the big other and the way and the research about the way plants have been portrayed in sci-fi and stuff like that. I did not expect so much to be out there in such details.
Yeah, me neither. That was
amazing.
That was like some of the most fun research, was just being like, there's this whole thing out there about plants that I wasn't aware of, and then I learned about it.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're coming towards the end of the talk. Thanks a million for agreeing to this. That was really super interesting and informative. And I'll be keeping up with your research, and I'd like to dive a little bit deeper in it now and look at other papers and stuff. Really, yeah. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was my first time on a
Yeah.
podcast, so thank you for hosting and for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
I wanted to ask you in conclusion, maybe if you have, and that's going to be a hard question because I don't know if I could answer myself, but if you have a favorite song or a favorite album by Meshuggah?
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a hard one.
Um,
Or maybe a
yeah, I
couple,
don't know.
you can cheat, it's fine.
Yeah, I'm gonna cheat.
Maybe one per
So
album.
I really love obZen.
Hmm.
I think in part because that was the first one that I really researched really heavily and got to know all the songs really well. I find that generally, like, the better I know a song of theirs, the more I love it.
Yeah, me too.
So I really love that whole album.
Hmm.
But I have to say that I really love Clockworks,
Yeah.
first track off of the most recent album. That's really good. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with, yeah, what would my I feel like I also think the title track off of
Oh yeah.
Violence and Reason is
Yeah,
really
me
good.
too.
I really love
Yeah.
that.
And I
Um,
feel like it's funny that you'd mentioned that because I feel like there's a Louisiana vibe to it, in the sense that, you know the album NOLA by Down?
mm-mm.
You know the band Down? It's one of the bands by Phil Anselmo, and they have this album called NOLA about Louisiana. You know Phil Anselmo from Pantera?
Yes, I do. He's a little he's in trouble now, but
Yeah, yeah, he's a bit, well, yeah, let's not
yeah.
mention that, but they but they have this track that is one of the most famous tracks of the album. I think it's called Bury Me in Smoke, and it has this like slidey intro, and they are sliding at different rates, and it really reminds me of The Violent Sleep of Reason, which is probably my favorite track on the last album. So yeah, I agree with that. But yeah, you should check it out. Maybe you might be interested.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, and yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that was a super interesting conversation. If you liked it, I would strongly recommend you check out her research because there is so much more to it than what we just touched on today. And so I would recommend you go see for yourself how deep the rabbit hole goes. This subject is really interesting to me. It brings all kinds of ideas to mind about the explanatory gap and theories of consciousness and stuff. And also the elephant and the blind man parable and so on and so forth. But I don't want to get too carried away just yet because it's time for the footnotes. Okay, so footnote 1 and 2. These are links to some papers we were mentioning. The first one is by Phillipov and the second one by Smialek. You have all the details in description. Footnote number 3, you have a link down there to a video from Edward Hansen's channel, the light engineer from Meshuggah. Footnote number 4, more info about the McGurk effect. So what I'm going to read to you right now is just straight out of Wikipedia, but I nonetheless think that it's interesting. The McGurk effect is a perceptual phenomenon that demonstrates an interaction between hearing and vision in speech perception. The illusion occurs when the auditory component of one sound is paired with the visual component of another sound, leading to the perception of a third sound. The visual information a person gets from seeing a person speak changes the way they hear the sound. And it was first described in 1976 in a paper by Harry McGurk and John MacDonald titled Hearing Lips and Seeing Voices in the journal Nature. Footnote number 5, you have a link down there to the Evelyn Glennie 2003 TED Talk that I really recommend you watch. Number 6, there's a link in the YouTube description of Thomas Harke describing Meshuggah's songwriting process on the album Colossus in 2012. Number 7, you have a link to David Foster Wallace, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, the cruise that Dr. Lucas was mentioning. Number 8, that's the link to the music theory online paper entitled Chasing the Phantom, Features of a Supracultural New Music, which is the Gamelan notation paper that Dr. Lucas referred to. Footnote number 9, you have a link to Jonathan Peaslake, famous Meshuggah paper entitled Recasting Metal, Rhythm and Meter in the Music of Meshuggah, published in 2007. Number 10, Guy Capuzzo. You have a link to his paper, 2018 paper, Rhythmic Deviance in the Music of Meshuggah. Number 11, you can find a link below to the profile of the Columbia University doctorate student who is studying the music of Car Bomb. Number 12, Unlocking the Groove by Mark Bertler. You have Amazon link there. Number 13, Cerulean. So that's the one-woman band, prog band that Dr. Lucas mentioned, and I give you a link to her Bandcamp account. By the way, I'm taking this opportunity to mention, I forgot to mention them, but I also saw Aliases, which has it's a prog band that I saw at Euroblast with an awesome female guitar player. There's also this like French band called Child of Waste, and obviously Entheos, but that's a female singer, but I still want to credit them because they are absolutely amazing, and they are one of the reasons that I do this podcast, because the singer and the drummer, who are in couple, started this Copper Crab podcast that I really enjoy, and that was also played a role in me starting the Cross-Pollination podcast. So I just wanted to thank them here and to acknowledge their inspiring me. Number 14, you have a link down below to Christopher Hasty's book, Meter as Rhythm. Footnote number 15, Noriko Manabe's paper, We Gon' Be Alright, The Ambiguities of Kendrick Lamar's Protest Anthem. And finally, last footnote, number 16, Joey Strauss' paper about disability and music theory. You have all of that below. Okay, well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Cross-Pollination podcast. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to support me if you can. That would be greatly appreciated. And I also wanted to tell you that I dropped an Easter egg in that episode and to see if anyone can find it. But until then, so long, and that's all for now.